Our subject, the Culture Wars Revisited. The opening presentation will be given by Andrew Hartman, Professor of History at Illinois State University. Professor Hartman was the founding president of the Society for U.S. Intellectual History. Among other publications, he is the author of A War for the Soul of America, a history of the culture wars, published by the University of Chicago Press, with a second edition forthcoming. I'm pleased to announce that Andrew will be sharing with us today a draft of a new chapter for his second edition of that great book on the culture wars, and then he'll be followed by 4 respondents. Brian Domitrovic is Associate Professor of History at Sam Houston State University in Texas. A graduate of Columbia and Harvard, his interests lie at the intersection of modern intellectual and economic history. His first book, Iconoclasts, published by ISI Books, is a history of supply-side economics. His second book, The Pillars of Reaganomics, is a collection of the work of economist Arthur Laffer. And with Larry Kudlow, he co-authored JFK and the Reagan Revolution, published by Portfolio Penguin. During the 2015-2016 academic term, he was the visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado Boulder. Lewis Moore is Associate Professor of History and coordinator of the African American Studies program at Grand Valley State University. He is the author of 2 books, both published last year. The first, published by the University of Illinois Press, is titled I Fight for a Living, Boxing and the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915. His second book, published by Prager, is titled We Will Win the Day, The Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality. Professor Moore's writing has appeared in USA Today and Vox, and he has been interviewed on National Public Radio and MSNBC. Michelle Nickerson is Associate Professor of History at Loyola University Chicago. She teaches courses on the history of women and gender, U.S. politics, social movements, and cities and suburbs, in addition to the Ramanat Seminar in American Catholic History and Culture. She is the author of Mothers of Conservatism, Women and the Post-War Right, published by Princeton University Press. She also co-edited a volume of essays titled Sunbelt Rising, The Politics of Place, Space, and Region, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. And John D. Wilsey is Associate Professor of Church History at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He was the 2017-2018 William E. Simon Visiting Fellow in Religion and Public Life at Princeton University with the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions. He is the author of One Nation Under God, an evangelical critique of Christian America, published by Wipf and Stock, and American Exceptionalism and Civil Religion, Reassessing the History of an Idea, published by IVP Academic. Professor Wilsey also edited an abridged edition of Tocqueville's classic work titled Democracy in America, a new abridgment for students, published by Lexham. He serves as affiliate scholar in theology and history at the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty here in Grand Rapids. Please join me in welcoming these speakers with a round of applause.
All right, thanks everyone for hanging out. Today's been an amazing day. My brain is doing intellectual gymnastics. Thanks again to Gleaves Whitney. I think what you do here, this is my 3rd time speaking at the Hauenstein Center Progressive Conservative Summit, and I think it's great, so I'm glad to be back. Thanks also to Scott St. Louis for doing a tremendous job organizing today. And then thanks in advance, hopefully, my 4 respondents. This is all very sort of raw, what I'm going to be presenting today, and I'm a little excited, but also a little afraid of what they have to say about it, so hopefully we'll have some fun. Make America Great Again. Donald Trump's now famous campaign slogan evokes the fervent belief among many Americans that the nation is no longer theirs. As the slogan deftly implies, once upon a time, things in America made sense. Right and wrong were distinguishable, hard work was rewarded, people respected authority, love of country was widely shared, as was faith in God. But this familiar America, this is what I call in the book, this normative America, now seems upside down in the eyes of millions of Americans. Of course, It's no coincidence that the rhetorical power of Make America Great Again peaked at the end of Barack Hussein Obama's 8 years in the White House. Nothing quite signals decline for many of the Trump faithful, like a black president with a Muslim name. Beyond its present-day appeal, though, Make America Great Again speaks to the declension narrative that has defined conservative attitudes since the 1960s. At bottom, I argue it's a nostalgic call to revive and restore the orderly, disciplined, and authority-respecting America that seemingly held fast before the 1960s. Related, very related, this was the America before the 60s social movements endowed people of color, women, gays and lesbians, immigrants from strange lands, and other seeming outsiders and fringe characters with the privilege to call themselves Americans. So in this way, Trump's slogan marks the latest volley in the culture wars that have polarized the United States for decades. Trump and his supporters are breathing new life into a venerable right-wing tradition of complaining that the nation went to hell in the age of Aquarius. Those on the left, by contrast, have tended to view American life through the eyes of those whose very existence challenges this normative America. As I argue in the larger book, these have long been the dividing lines in the culture wars. So Trump's rise to the White House seems to indicate that the culture wars endure. In the years prior to Trump's improbable victory, many observers, myself included, predicted that the culture wars were dying. So in the conclusion to the first edition of my book, which was published in 2015, but which I wrote in 2014, I argued that the logic of the culture wars had been exhausted, that the metaphor had run its course. So this forecast, despite what you might be thinking right now, was not the product of naivety, of me being naive. No self-respecting historian could pretend to believe that Americans had come to a peaceful conclusion or a peaceful consensus on the issues that had polarized the nation since the 60s. To name but a few of these issues that I deal with at length in my book: abortion, affirmative action, controversial art and censorship, evolution, feminism, gay rights, multiculturalism, national history standards, pornography, school prayer, and sex education, to name but a few. So I argued in that original conclusion that cultural conflict would indeed persist, as it has throughout American history, but I suggested as well that such conflict was now being fought in a different register. The language seemed different. This register, one shaped by the ever-intensifying disruptions that neoliberalism has been wreaking on American life. Now, this term neoliberalism has been mentioned in quite a few of the talks during the last few days, and I would define it, just to sort of give a sense of what I mean by this, I would define it by a sort of pervasive, widespread ideology or notion that society is best organized by the logic of the market, instead of other logics such as the logic of the state. So this prognosis that I made in the original edition of my book, Trump certainly complicates it. But as I'm going to argue today, it's premature to suggest that Trump has overthrown it. Rather, I think we can get a firmer handle on the state of current American political conflict by asking questions that extend beyond Trump as a leader or Trumpism as some sort of social movement. It may well be, for instance, that what we're seeing and experiencing is a new brand of identity-themed insurgency, one that might prove more sinister and more abiding than the conflicts of the recent past. And what I'm also arguing is that perhaps the two most dominant forces in American history writ large, cultural conflict on the one hand and capitalism on the other, have co-conspired to create a political culture that's more divided and more despairing than anything in the recent past. So there's been worsening polarization. One of the principal effects of worsening polarization is a crisis of legitimacy. An overwhelming majority of Americans are disaffected with government, with other elite institutions such as the media and higher education. Such alienation manifests in assorted ways. Take, for instance, opposition to what's known as political correctness. This is a term that first gained renown in the early 1990s as a critique of universities that sought to regulate speech. A full quarter century later, the battles over political correctness have intensified. Conservative media dedicates countless hours to lamenting safe spaces, trigger warnings, snowflakes, and other signs of civilizational collapse. Much of this debate, of course, is reminiscent of the earlier PC wars of the early 90s. More to the point, though, political correctness has morphed into a catch-all label or a catch-all pejorative, targeting assorted elites who seem utterly afraid to speak the truth about controversial issues. As an important 2016 sociological study finds, 3 out of 4 Americans believe that political correctness is a serious problem. And, quote, this makes it hard for people to say what they really think. So it's no wonder then that President Trump's frequent vulgar outbursts resonate with people, whereas many see his speaking style as ignorant, irresponsible, downright cruel. Many others, many of his supporters, view him as an unvarnished truth teller in an age of political correctness. Either way, nobody ever accuses our tweeter-in-chief of political correctness. So, to reiterate, these divisions in American life are tenacious, but they've also been modified in crucial ways. So the sociologist James Davison Hunter, who wrote the first scholarly analysis of the culture wars in 1991 in a book of that title, Culture Wars, Hunter has recently argued that, quote, where the culture wars of the last several decades were fought over sexuality, religion, and family, today's culture wars offer a new set of cultural battles linked with the shifting economic circumstances, including globalization, immigration, and the boundaries of legitimate pluralism. So cultural conflict, if we take this seriously, has fused with class-based divisions to create an unusually toxic politics, even by American standards. This changing character of American polarization can be seen in the uneven distribution of disaffection. So, a few examples. The elderly are more likely now to distrust the government than the young, white more than black, rural more than urban, and religious more than secular. The most divergent category of all is education. Those lacking a college education are highly prone to alienation from government. Those with advanced degrees are, as a group, some of the happiest in our nation with the government and with other elite institutions. So this is where class seems to matter in ways even more than it used to. In our post-industrial order, education is highly determinative, more determinative of life chances. For example, educational credentials tend to track how badly people have suffered from the ongoing effects of the 2008 recession. A credential gap has morphed onto enduring cultural divisions. And so for me, this helps explain why the culture wars seem more urgent, more existential, you might say, than ever. So the sociological study from 2016 that I mentioned, they asked a whole bunch of people about their attitudes towards government. When asked about their attitudes towards government, racial minorities, especially African Americans, were registered as those among the least alienated. They were happier with government than most other groups as the groups in the survey were measured. So this might seem odd for a whole host of reasons, especially because Black Americans lost vastly disproportionate household wealth as a result of the 2008 meltdown. And I think African Americans have a host of other reasons to complain about the government. But it makes more sense when we consider that this survey from which I draw my data was conducted in 2016 when Obama was still president. Needless to say, this same basic dynamic operates on the other side of the racial divide. Just as Obama represents or represented a sense of political belonging for Black Americans, Trump seems to epitomize the social grouping that has rallied under Hillary Clinton's unfortunate basket of deplorables label: older, rural, uncredentialed, and yes, white. Race has always been at the forefront of American political life. This is a sort of basic fact I think we have to understand before we go into any further analysis. But in the wake of the civil rights movement, officially sanctioned expressions of racism lessened. Even conservatives of the type who had once unapologetically defended white supremacy tended to shift gears and instead address racial problems using colorblind language. Critics referred to such colorblindness as coded racism. Yet a formal commitment to racial equality on the part of American institutions was at least tangible evidence of progress. That racial inequality persisted despite this commitment left many Americans confused. Now, however, it seems as if such confusion no longer seems to be a problem. With the Trumpist capture of the American right, the racial lines of the culture wars seem to be redrawn in crystal clear fashion. Deciphering code is no longer necessary. On the one side is Trump, the man who advanced the astonishingly popular birther crusade that questioned the first Black president's citizenship and by extension his legitimacy as president. The man who, the list goes on, the man who called undocumented Mexican immigrants rapists and murderers and who has promised to build a wall between Mexico and the United States. The man who issued a ban on select Muslims from entering the country. On the other side is Black Lives Matter. Whereas Trump called the mostly Black NFL players who kneel during the national anthem sons of bitches, celebrated Black athletes like LeBron James or Stephen Curry speak openly about Trump's bigotry. So what I'm saying is that things seem different now than they did a few decades ago. During the 1980 presidential campaign, Ronald Reagan gave a speech in Neshoba County, Mississippi, which is where 3 civil rights activists were murdered during the Freedom Summer of 1964. When Reagan announced in that particular location his belief in states' rights, he was tacitly signaling that he sympathized with white Southerners who longed for a return to Jim Crow. But when Trump recently called the Tiki Torch white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville last year very fine people, I'm thinking there was nothing tacit about this endorsement. So the upshot of Trump discarding coded rhetoric about race is that our political discourse seems at once both more vicious but also more honest. Aligning almost perfectly with the national debate over race, to speak of another division that has persisted, the division over guns has also hardened in recent years. So when we think about guns, we think about the culture wars. This is not to say that gun control is a new issue in the culture wars. In 1997, then NRA Vice President Charlton Heston delivered a tongue-in-cheek speech before NRA followers, or NRA members, that was titled simply "Fighting the Culture War in America." Quote, this is Heston, "The God-fearing, law-abiding, Caucasian middle-class Protestant, or even worse, evangelical Christian, Midwestern or Southern, or even worse, rural, apparently straight, or even worse, admitted heterosexuals, gun-owning, or even worse, NRA card-carrying, average working stiff, or even worse, male working stiff. Because not only don't you count, you are a downright obstacle to social progress. Your voice deserves a lower decibel level, your opinion is less enlightened, and frankly, mister, you need to wake up, wise up, and learn a little something from your new America. And until you do, would you mind shutting up?" Like I said, tongue-in-cheek. And so guns, you know, if Charlton Heston represents one side in the gun debate, guns were not new to the culture wars. Yet during the 80s and 90s, which are really the heyday of the culture wars that I deal with in my book, guns rarely rose to the top of any roster of leading flashpoints in the conflict. But then in 1999 came Columbine, which was the first widely publicized school massacre, followed, it seems, by wave after wave of mass shootings. Almost 20 years later, guns might be the single most divisive issue in American politics. National Review writer David French has recently worried that the gun debate, because in his words it has become a true culture kampf, in which empathy for the other side has evaporated, he worries that the gun debate might break America. So in this view of what might seem like the intractable posturing that is now blocking honest debate, these two tribal antagonists play their role in perfectly ritualistic fashion. In the aftermath of each horrific massacre, gun control advocates renew their tormented calls for laws that would make it more difficult for psychos to obtain deadly military-grade weapons. In response, politicians in the pocket of the gun lobby offer thoughts and prayers. After a few days of thinking and praying, spokespeople for the NRA blitz the media with complaints that their antagonists are politicizing tragedy. No laws get passed, rinse, repeat. This is the ritualistic cycle. The recent massacre at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, has, as you all know, spurred a wave of activism led by students who survived the attack. That these articulate young survivors are leading the charge has indeed, at least it seemed when I wrote this, made it more difficult for the gun lobby to smear the motives of their opponents, but certainly not for lack of trying. Wayne LaPierre, who's head of the NRA, used the occasion of his first speech after Parkland to rattle on about a socialist wave that was infecting young people, and he argued that if the socialist agenda is successful, our American freedoms could be lost, especially apparently our boundless freedom to own assault rifles. So in response to the predictable ridicule that LaPierre's speech generated, Trump took to Twitter to affirm that Wayne is a great American patriot. He then signed off, all caps, "Make America Great Again." So I guess, you know, what I've talked about so far would indicate that the culture wars that I predicted were over are defiantly not over. In fact, they're more sort of trenchant than ever. But even as the two sides in the culture wars dig deep trenches along some fronts, making headway in either direction nearly impossible, other fronts have seen movement. For instance, over the past several years, the religious right has been losing the culture wars over sexuality, religion, and the family. But this liberal victory has not led to peace and tranquility, in fact, quite the opposite. To give one example of evangelical decline, the nation's attitudes about homosexuality and gay rights have become much more tolerant, codified by the landmark 2015 Supreme Court decision in Obergefell v. Hodges, which guaranteed same-sex couples the right to marry. Although that decision did spark, again predictably, a sort of set of jeremiads from some conservative leaders, these mostly seem to have fell on deaf ears. Now, even a majority of Republicans under the age of 50 support same-sex marriage. This radical attitudinal shift has forced leaders of, for example, Focus on the Family and the Southern Baptist Convention to admit defeat in the gay marriage debate. Even when religious conservatives have gained political leverage to enact local laws that you might say match their view of sexuality, they continue to lose the larger national debate, it seems. So in response, for example, to Indiana's Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which notoriously granted Indiana bakers the right to refuse to sell wedding cakes to same-sex couples, several major corporations boycotted the state, leading to what has been estimated at about $70 million in revenue lost. Similarly, when North Carolina mandated in 2016 that individuals can only use public single-sex bathrooms that correspond to the sex identified on their birth certificates, which was seen, which is an obvious attack on transgender rights, the NBA moved the 2017 All-Star Game from Charlotte to New Orleans. Another measure, I would argue, of evangelical decline is the religious right's embrace of the brash philanderer in the White House. So in the face of the sexual revolution, the religious right has long promoted the ideal of chaste and pious political leaders. Now, hypocrisy might have been written into this ideal from the start, since, let's be honest, the feature that most attracted the religious right to politicians was their politics. If chastity and piety were prerequisites, Reagan might not have been so palatable to evangelicals. As one Jimmy Carter supporter bitterly pointed out, he was extremely bitter when saying this because it was right after Reagan had defeated Carter. He said, "Reagan was a Hollywood libertine, had a child conceived out of wedlock before he and Nancy married, admitted to drug use during his Hollywood years, and was one of the least religious presidents in American history." And yet, Reagan won, as I'm sure we all know, over 65% of the white evangelical vote over the pious, even scolding, born-again Carter. What mattered was that Reagan aligned himself with conservative evangelicals who were less interested in his personal history than they were in his political positions. So we might say the same for Trump, who has indeed already managed to give the religious right the gift of a Supreme Court justice, by far its most coveted political spoil. And this is, difficult to sort of think about, but I think that going forward, we have to consider that proportion matters. Trump's improprieties are legion. I don't know that there will be a return to the pious ideal for someone like Franklin Graham, who proclaimed of Trump's 2016 victory that it was God's hand at work. He said this mere weeks after the release of the infamous Pussy tape, which caught Trump bragging about sexual assault. On January 21st, 2017, the day after Trump's inauguration, hundreds of thousands of women adorning pink, what they called pussy hats, marched on Washington, D.C. In all, an estimated 5 million people worldwide marched that day in what was called the Women's March. This announced that Trump would be met at defiance at every step. It seemed that his election had kickstarted a renewed feminism that came to call itself simply the resistance. It also seemed as if a conventional division in the culture wars, feminism versus the patriarchal backlash, had been reignited. But this feminist reawakening has had seemingly unintended consequences that have largely exploded stable political alliances. In 2017, dozens of women came forward to accuse Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein of sexual abuse. He was fired from the company that he and his brother helped found, and he was dismissed from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Weinstein's abusive behavior had long been known in Hollywood circles, but he was never previously held accountable for the simple reason that his victims correctly believed that Weinstein and his cronies would blackball them in retaliation should they speak out. But in a climate transformed by this female resistance, in the hashtag #MeToo climate, the tables turned on predators like Weinstein. Several more famous men fell from grace in rapid order, including Louis C.K., Kevin Spacey, and Al Franken. What's curious is that political alliance no longer saved such men. Gloria Steinem defended Bill Clinton in the 1990s against accusations of sexual misconduct and abuse of power, because to her, a president who opposed the Christian right agenda was more important than bringing down a single sexual predator, no matter how powerful. In contrast, hardly anyone has come to the defense of the people who have recently been sort of brought out into the open as sexual deviants, or sexual predators, I should say. Like, nobody really came to the defense of Franken, who lost his Senate seat despite his pro-feminist record. So it might seem that feminism is transcending the older culture wars, evidence perhaps that it is prevailing in some sense. Mark Lilla last night talked about a cultural revolution that was very real, and I think this is apt. Still, it should be noted that if Me Too signals feminist success, this victory will not be smooth. Culture war victories never are. So signs of a turbulent adjustment period are already on the horizon as justice bleeds into panic. One such example, citing the logic of Me Too, a woman recently circulated a petition to have a 1938 Balthus painting removed from the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, because she thinks it depicts a teenage girl as a sex object. And there will also undoubtedly be more ominous modes of backlash. Many of the tiki-toting white supremacists tend to be young men struggling to find a meaningful, traditionally masculine existence in an America that they believe is currently overrun with feminist, man-hating privilege. So this tour of recent culture war battlegrounds, I would argue, discloses two key trends. First, that economic anxiety and class resentment have mapped onto cultural divisions to make the culture wars angrier, more tribal, and more fundamental than perhaps ever before, or at least in recent history. Second, that some older culture war struggles are subsiding due in part to progressive success in these battles. But by way of charting a possible avenue of post-culture war resistance, I would add a countervailing observation. Appearances to the contrary in Trump's America, cultural conflict is not the only division possible. In the depths of our neoliberal order, class struggle of a sort might overtake cultural conflict as the defining antagonism in American life. So in this, I'm not arguing that cultural conflict is dead, far from it. Arguments about American identity, which is really at the basis about what cultural conflict has always been about, arguments even about human nature, these are always going to be present in American political life. A nation founded on capacious and contradictory ideas like liberty, the pursuit of happiness, is bound to have such debates, especially a nation as religiously, racially, and ethnically diverse as the United States. What I am arguing is that the 1980s, the 1990s, this is the time period in my book This was a particular time in the never-ending American culture wars, and that the culture wars, cultural conflict, really came to define that era. And so I would argue that perhaps we should think about that era as the era of the culture wars and capitalize it much as we capitalize the Gilded Age. I mean, this is not to say that capitalism or class struggle were inconsequential in these, in the 1980s and 1990s. Capitalism, I would argue, is always a force in American life, often a much stronger force than cultural conflict. But how we think about such historical forces shifts alongside how we think about historical time. In discussing the long period between the American Civil War and the present, which is something I think about a lot because I teach a U.S. history survey from the Civil War to the present, capitalism sits atop, for me, any hierarchy of important forces that are shaping historical change. Which is not to say that cultural conflict is absent from that long period in American history, far from it. Rather, I would just say that the best way, not the only way, but the best way to argue how we got from here to there, from the Civil War to the present, is really a deep understanding of the history of capitalism. Cultural conflict, or the culture wars, in this long period were a more subterranean historical force. Alas, sometimes these subterranean historical forces come to the surface, sometimes with a bang. So when we shorten our historical time frame to the era bracketed by the 60s, the 1960s, and the 1990s, which is the frame of historical time that I look at in my book, a new hierarchy of historical forces comes into view. So the best way to understand how we got from Woodstock to Monica Lewinsky is to understand the history of the culture wars. But the historical forces of the culture wars, and here's where I'm stepping out on a ledge because I'm talking about the present, doing very contemporary history. The historical forces of the culture wars are perhaps not the best way to understand the present. There has been perhaps a shift back to thinking about capitalism and class as a major point of historical emphasis. So let me spend a bit of time concluding by discussing developments in higher education, especially in the humanities, and show how this shift might already be in the works. So during the culture wars of the 80s and 90s, left and right shared a commitment to the value of the humanities as a crucial element of American higher education. What the antagonists in these debates disagreed upon at this point, often ferociously, was how to define and how to teach the humanities: history, philosophy, literature, the languages. Conservatives in these debates contended that the humanities should accord with traditional hierarchies and that all American college students should read the Western canon as they defined it, typically limited to a core group of texts that were, perhaps authored by dead white men. In contrast, academic leftists sought a more inclusive, multicultural curriculum and argued that they should read texts to challenge hierarchy. So different views of the humanities that caused a lot of contention, but everyone in this debate shared an interest in the humanities as crucial to any general curriculum and really as crucial to understanding what it means to live in America, to be an American. A few examples. Alan Bloom's 1987 book, The Closing of the American Mind, made a rigorous, if eccentric, case for a classic humanities education rooted in the Western canon. Bloom believed that a humanities education should provide students with what he called 4 years of freedom, which he described as a space between the intellectual wasteland the student has left behind and the inevitable dreary professional training that awaits him after graduation. Campus leftists were predictably unimpressed by Bloom's dismissal of texts or books authored by women minorities, and non-Westerners. For Bloom, just the mere introduction of such books into the canon by virtue of identity was like an attack on intellectual standards because these texts tended to lack merit compared to the great books authored by the likes of Adam Smith and Rousseau. What demands remembering, though, even as Bloom's book got thrown into the culture war struggle, is that Bloom's deeply anti-utilitarian defense of the humanities resonated with many Americans, including many conservatives. Indeed, it surprisingly shot up to the top of the bestseller lists. It sold almost 1 million copies in its first year. To today's neoliberal ears, his argument for passionate engagement with ultimate questions sounds like a quaint echo of the distant past. The 60s liberation movements and the ensuing conservative backlash foregrounded the humanities as they had never been foregrounded before. Both sides looked to the humanities for legitimacy. Moreover, both left and right articulated educational philosophies that were founded on opposition to economic utility. Just as Bloom wanted his students to experience learning as an encounter with the sublime, multiculturalists desired an education that transcended the sordid world of American capitalism. This was even true of the most enthusiastic promoter of identity politics, who have long been accused of subordinating liberal education to the dictates of politics or the dictates of power. So in her 1970 book, Sexual Politics, Kate Millett wrote that what can be described as distinctly human rather than animal activity is largely reserved for the male. So Millett merely wanted to extend the realm of humanity, the realm of the humanities, to women. But in today's dog-eat-dog world of neoliberal capitalism, a humanities education that is designed to inculcate intellectual curiosity and humanistic empathy serves no purpose. In other words, today's neoliberal order seems to me fine with revised canons, with more inclusive or multicultural understandings of the world, but not with public money supporting something so seemingly useless as the humanities. Today, many conservatives have seemingly abandoned their traditionalist defense of the Western canon in favor of no canon at all. But culture warriors on both sides have been overtaken by events. A bipartisan consensus that emphasizes job training now dominates. So when young people flocked to the Bernie Sanders campaign, they of course responded enthusiastically to his offer to make higher education free. This enthusiasm was definitely, in part, a product of the disastrous impact that ballooning student debt visits upon their life prospects. But more than that, I think, young people also yearn for human existence that transcends what seems like a soul-crushing neoliberal order. So this new division between the technocratic rulers of a deeply unequal society and the idealistic young Americans who want something better, to me this hardly resembles the culture wars of yesteryear. It feels rather like a new kind of struggle, perhaps a type of class struggle. Although the outcome of these underdeveloped struggles is far from certain, they furnish hope to those like me, exhausted with the culture wars, to those who are looking for a way out of the pitched and dispiriting trench warfare of the American culture conf. To those like me who wrote in my original conclusion that the culture wars are history. Thank you.
Talk about the culture wars in the 1970s and 80s and how conservatives first engaged them in the field of fine art, and that any history of the culture wars have to take the sophisticated arguments that conservatives made about fine art as opposed to more degenerate art, as a point of origin of the culture wars, and the main actors are the art critic Hilton Kramer and the journal The New Criterion. In a culture war that really mattered, that of Germany from the time of Nietzsche through that of Hitler, an imperative distinction was that between culture and civilization. As Thomas Mann and others strove to specify it, the distinction went approximately as follows. Civilization referred to the wider world of fine art, manners, sophistication, advancement, and cosmopolitanism, and culture to the universe of the home base, of family, lineage, traditions, homeliness, and the passage of rights by means of the spoken word and homespun prose. The formulation of Ferdinand Tönnies's oppositional Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft captured this distinction, even as Gesellschaft was irredeemably pejorative as soulless society, and Gemeinschaft so innocently warm and fuzzy, it remains a venerable part of the German and indeed even the American lexicon. We can say today, without any hint of even making a faux pas, things like, that book club is a wonderful little Gemeinschaft. It is important to note that the term Kulturkampf that arose in Germany in the 1870s had nothing to do with this distinction. Rather, the Kulturkampf was narrowly Bismarck's effort to stamp out the impress of Catholicism on the social and political life of the country just founded in 1871 under the traditionally small-fry Protestant monarch in Berlin, as opposed to the older, more venerable Catholic monarch in Vienna. After a few years, Bismarck saw that Catholic loyalty in the new imperial Germany was not in question, and he dropped the Kulturkampf cold. Bismarck's Kulturkampf is not what mattered for world history. What mattered was the idea, probably a false one, that there is naturally a conflict in the world of the many simple people, those of culture, in the Tönnies sense, and the sliver of leading sophisticated people, that of civilization. In Andrew Hartman's new essay, and in his book, A War for the Soul of America, we get the culture war pretty much as the classic modern distinction between culture and civilization in the American context. On the one side, and I quote from the new essay we just heard, are those for whom an imagined past world is normative, a world where, quote, right and wrong were distinguishable, hard work was rewarded, people respected authority, and love of country was widely shared, as was faith in God. This is culture in the Tönnies Gemeinschaft sense. On the other side of the culture war, and fitting rather well enough the category of civilization, are those progressive advocates of, again, quoting Professor Hartman's new essay, abortion, affirmative action, controversial art and evolution, feminism, gay rights, multiculturalism, pornography, and sex education. I was concerned when reading a book on the history of the culture wars in modern America that it said next to nothing about the conservative preferences within one central aspect of civilization, that of high culture. I was concerned because there is an excellent case to be made that this high culture is where the culture wars in America were first engaged as such, indeed by conservatives who had impressive and ambitious visions for high culture. To be specific, there was a major journal that was founded in 1982 at the dawn of the period, the 1980s and 1990s, decades that, according to this essay, were a particularly hot time in the never-ending American culture wars. A journal whose express purpose was to hold aloft the aesthetic nature of the conservative side in the culture wars. This journal was The New Criterion, modeled as it was on T.S. Eliot's traditionalist modernist journal of earlier in the century, The Criterion. Moreover, the co-founder of The New Criterion, the art critic Hilton Kramer, had been explicitly fighting the culture wars on the turf of high culture for 2 decades, from 1965 to 1982, from no less a perch than as the New York Times' Dean of the Arts, as Tom Wolfe once referred to Hilton Kramer. I find it implausible that we can have a history of the culture wars in America without extensive attention devoted to the conservative preferences in high culture, and specifically to the efforts of the new criterion after 1982, and to Hilton Kramer across his career from the 1950s to the 2000s. Kramer and the new criterion represented, from avowedly within the conservative position, the idea that modern art is a good and rich development, one that should be encouraged to assist our society in reaching new heights of benevolence, depth of feeling, intelligence, and proper judgment. Yes, this was an important conservative position on art, on modern art, in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s. It is well documented across the arts publications and was a mainstay in places like the classes on post-war American cultural and intellectual history at the University of Michigan, taught by Stephen Tonser and David Hollinger. The classic statements of this position may be found in the immense codifications of the work of Hilton Kramer that must be cited in any history of the culture wars, his books The Age of the Avant-Garde of 1973 and The Revenge of the Philistines of 1984. The position adopted by self-identified conservatives in America on modern art was that that movement represented one of the greatest renaissances in aesthetic history and was ripening to our great fortune in the United States in the years after World War II. All sorts of penetrating and wholesome aesthetic and moral questions were being probed in the sculpture of David Smith, Louise Nevelson, and Saul Beiserman, and among the work of countless fascinating painters in similar schools. Hilton Kramer proposed in programmatic statements that made the point unmistakable that modern art was a healthy, his word, coefficient to the rise of bourgeois society. Here at last was a society that could be both broadly affluent and good at the same time. The key step was for bourgeois society to keep its attention on achieving this potentiality, a potentiality that was the singular bequest and opportunity of modern history to be both well off and good at the same time. As Kramer recounted in his book, The Age of the Avant-Garde, originally the bourgeoisie had been unsure of itself, worried that it was too materialistic and fearful, perhaps correctly, of what havoc its great economic wealth could do if brought to bear in erotic adventures. This second-guessing within the bourgeoisie caused a hesitation in the bourgeoisie that jeopardized progress towards the extension of affluence to ever more people and risked making personalities stodgy and Puritan instead of fully human. The purpose of modern art, Kramer held, was to help the bourgeoisie overcome these problems in a wholesome way. But modern art had an enemy from within. This was its own underside, which connived to undermine the impressive productivities and relevance of the leading edge of modern art. Modern art consisted of a main tradition epitomized by Matisse in France, the perfection and ideal type of the artistic coefficient of bourgeois culture, with healthy followers in America, including the likes of Smith and Nevelson and a good many others. Figures such as Marcel Duchamp and Salvador Dali drove the counter-tradition. Dada and Surrealism strove to discredit the artistic and moral quality of modern art by means of catchy but insidious modern art of its own. Americans here would include Andy Warhol in the nearly whole universe of pop art and postmodernism. The figure who straddled this line through the heart, as it were, of the modern art tradition was the giant of the period, Pablo Picasso, the artistic counterpart in this way to Martin Heidegger in philosophy, who straddled the helpful and unhelpful traditions in modern philosophy. A Kramer passage on Picasso from The Revenge of the Philistines, again a book published in the early thick of the 1980s culture wars, is one of the great clarifying statements of the aesthetic imperatives of conservatives at the dawn of the culture war debate. In surveying a Picasso retrospective at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and I'd like to add, if people think this is a little too European, not American, Picasso was a giant figure in the United States, as Guernica, of course, exhibited for so many years in New York. Last night, Richard Norton Smith was telling us about how he visited David Rockefeller's office in New York, and of course he went into a room filled with Picassos. And anyone who has ever buttled into William F. Buckley's parlor while the butler was getting your drinks and the Cavalier King Charles is nipped at your heels, there were Picassos on the wall in William F. Buckley's maisonette on the Upper East Side. In surveying a Picasso retrospective of the MoMA in New York, which included all of Picasso's hideous depictions of women from the 1930s, and his great pre-Great War Cubist studies, and the terrifying political avowal Guernica, which in its explicit social concern was a towering exception to everything Picasso had ever done, Kramer laid out the stakes. In the Cubist period before 1915, Kramer wrote in The Revenge of the Philistines, and here's a long passage from Hilton Kramer. This is his words. He was an amazing writer. For the first time in Picasso's work, we are made to feel, before 1915, that all worldly distraction is in abeyance, and the pressures and inspiration of mind, of pure thought, are firmly in control. Cleverness has been eschewed, facility resisted, and sensual impulse held in check. The hammering ego that creates such a din in the later work of Picasso is not yet unleashed to wreak its havoc. An inspired detachment, wielding extraordinary powers of analysis, exerts a magisterial authority. And for a few magical years, Picasso sustains his art on a plateau of Apollonian emotion. This was surely one of the sublime achievements of the human spirit. This astonishing number of great Cubist paintings, drawings, collages, and sculptures, which afford one of the most incomparable experiences that art can offer us. There is nothing like the awful sense of spiritual debacle that we feel in the latter portion of Picasso's career. The disarray of those late years remains terrifying to contemplate and sends us hurrying back to the halcyon years of Cubist splendor for a renewal of our faith in Picasso's genius and integrity. That's the end of his line. It's his review of that exhibition in 1980. The whole thing is amazing. Picasso's Rage is its title. And so went one of the defining statements of the stakes involved in the culture wars in 1984. The gauntlet that conservatives threw down was clear. We have discovered in modernism, outstanding tools to make us better as a successful society. Yet an egocentric, facile, and jealous enemy has challenged modernism from within. The dark side of the avant-garde, Warhol, postmodernism, Dali, and so forth, seeks to thwart the healthy goals of modernism by defining all modern art as transgressive, ugly, and alternatively hectoring and useless. Robert Mapplethorpe, in a word. The purpose of the culture wars was, in Kramer's central view in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, was to support and nourish the good and real side of modernism at the expense of its challenger. I fear that our left-of-center commentators on the culture wars do not prefer to speak of these things as important to the culture wars because first, sometimes these commentators have little comprehension that conservatives have impressive views on high culture, and second, because these views are far too substantial and meaningful to deal with summarily. Conservatives are simple. If they have tastes in high culture, they must be dowdy ones. These are cliches that have no foundation given the mountain of evidence indicating that profound arguments about high culture were a great opening salvo of the conservative side in the culture wars. Such conservative arguments complicate, perhaps beyond all hope of recovery, the implied narrative of simple-mindedness, atavism, and backwardness about culture, and the right that the Progressive Academy continues to hold dear. To close, by the way, there is news that Hilton Kramer may not have seen something essential about Andy Warhol, and thus perhaps the entire basis of the Duchamp-Dali trajectory in America through Mapplethorpe. The news is that Andy Warhol was chaste and a lifelong daily communicant at Holy Mass. Perhaps the counter-tradition that dogged modernism had within it a mole of its own all along.
Thank you for the Hauenstein Center for having me, and Scott, is this on? Yeah, you hear? And Scott for reaching out to me. This feels different. It's one of my favorite phrases from the new conclusion of A War for the Soul of America. At this point in the conclusion, Hartman is discussing MAGA and Trump's open appeal to race during the campaign. And he was right. This felt different. All the racism that had supposedly been hiding out was bubbling to the surface. I couldn't stand my drive to work that fall. And to be clear, I worked way out there in Allendale. The normal, beautiful, and quiet drive felt different, eerie, especially with the dead deer as they lay next to the Trump-Pence signs along the road. It felt like an omen, a sign that something was going to change. And then Don Jr. came to campus. And I knew we were in for it. The man who likes to call others snowflakes, as Hartman notes, this language is part of the new culture war, was cowering behind the stage for damn near an hour as students protested his presence, the resistance before the resistance. They shouted stuff I can't remember, but your typical college students pushing back. But there to meet them, the kids in the MAGA hats and the shirts with chants of build that wall, and USA, USA, a chant meant to tell others they don't belong, but a chant that clearly should stay in the 80s at wrestling matches featuring Hulk Hogan and Hacksaw Jim Duggan. But today, USA has been adopted by the right as a way somehow to say this is their country. And then there was the MAGA phrase. I hate that phrase. Even worse, nobody in mainstream was calling it out. When was America great? That's not a question meant to suggest that America isn't great. But you can only go back 50 years to get to the Fair Housing Act, which was passed a couple days ago, last week, 50 years ago. And 53 years to get to, 55 years to get to the Voting Rights Act. My father was born in 1946 in North Carolina. I was born in the late 1970s. I'm the first male in our family line to born with his full rights. To anybody who has been paying attention, and that's everybody, including Russian bots, indeed, this time felt different. As Hartman brilliantly points out, in the MAGA movement unleashed a new and more toxic version of the culture wars. The rebuted culture wars were terrible, though. In this conclusion, he points out three main changes in what appears to be part of the culture wars: rhetoric, racism, and the continued gun control debate. The section I labeled rhetoric is there to capture the new growing sentiment about speech on campus. Snowflakes, trigger warnings, and a term he should probably consider using in his paper, microaggressions. And to be clear, microaggressions is the new term that everybody was talking about, and this is actually what got the president of Missouri fired for being racially insensitive with microaggressions, right? These are all part of the rebuild culture war attack on PC culture. This time, there's demand that all voices count, or all lives matter on campuses. And more have speakers who are from the far right, who have bought into the MAGA movement and stopped hiding their words. College kids are inviting them to speak and spew the anti-immigration stance, for instance, or bringing white nationalists like Richard Spencer, as he was at Michigan State last month, all in the name of diverse thought, daring the left to say, you want free speech, here it is. They're simply saying, and then they mock and attack students who don't want to hear that. This gets us to another point highlighted in this piece. The idea that Trump and his supporters stopped using coded words. They were just going to be racist, attacking Muslims, Mexicans, and other marginalized groups with threats. And the policies have shown a ban or attempted ban on Muslims. ICE seems to be always coming. And NFL players, as he pointed out in his piece, who participate during national anthems or who protest during national anthems are called disloyal sons of bitches. As we all know, when others verbally attack Trump, and in this piece he mentions Steph Curry and LeBron James, Trump hits back. That's who he is. But when called out for his racism, we also know he only goes after people of color. For instance, Jamel Harrell versus Eminem. And if you haven't heard what Eminem had to say, you should check that out. It's pretty bad. And there was no comment towards that. And then there's the gun control debate. To be sure, we've been having this debate for a while. Recently, I was going through newspapers in 1968 and threaded some on my Twitter account. Shameless plug, I'm at Lumore12. And if you want to look up and put MLK50 at Lumore12, and I threaded a lot of newspapers from April 1968 all over the country to talk about King and how we felt. And the gun control debate was there. There was a push to ban guns after the assassination of King, but nothing was done. As we saw members of the NRA and just your regular Joe write into newspapers, they still needed their powerful weapons to hunt. And of course, there were the riots. What if the riots came to Grosse Pointe? But today, this debate has taken on a familiar and sad pattern. As Hartman notes, there's the mass shootings, which seems more frequent, and then there's the outrage. And then comes the NRA with thoughts and prayers. So here we are, innocent lives lost and nothing changes. The culture wars seem to be here to stay. But Hartman offers that there have been some changes, mainly in religion and feminism. The religious right has seemingly lost some ground. In red states, as he mentions, they have passed laws and people pushed back and businesses have followed. In Indiana, when Pence passed the legislation that allowed businesses to discriminate, outside vendors threatened to pull out the state, costing the state millions of dollars, as he mentioned. And when North Carolina passed the bathroom bill, the NBA moved their All-Star game out of Charlotte. But to be clear, the Charlotte Hornets continue to play there, and the All-Star game is coming back. So I think that's something we have to deal with. Hartman also honestly notes that the religious right has lost some high ground as they support Trump and his allegations, or people like Roy Moore. And he notes that feminism has transcended all of this. The Me Too movement is a great example of this. In the past, people seemingly lined up in political camps to protect their own. I believe he gave the Bill Clinton example. But in this new movement, Weinstein is gone and Franklin resigned. But in a minor critique that I have, I'd actually hold off on this critique if I were him. Nobody really penalized Roy Moore. The right isn't condemning Wynne, as I believe a couple days ago, Sarah Huckabee Sanders said he didn't even admit to this, so why should we say anything? And they still ride with Trump. But with all this, Hartman is hesitant to label this a culture war reboot. Instead, he notes that capitalism trumps culture, that what happened between the late 60s and mid-90s was a quick shift from capitalism, and now we're back at capitalism. Culture conflict, as he says, were more subterranean historical force. Alas, sometimes subterranean historical forces come to the surface, sometimes with a bang, unquote. And then he goes on to say, quote, there has been a shift back to capitalism and class struggle as a major point of historical emphasis. He goes on to offer his take on what is happening with our universities, which I agree on. It's fabulous. If you have a chance to read the full thing, please do. What used to be an embrace in them and acknowledgement on both sides that they've served public good has now seen an attack on them. We've seen a decline in state and federal investment in schools as they continue to jack up the cost of college. In face of this, universities push STEM, and let's be honest, we've all heard them say that they really mean STEAM, and they don't. College should only be about getting a job, they say. None of this liberal arts stuff or humanities stuff matters. And they build monuments to sciences. I can scan the room and see who's in here. We built a $65 million science museum, and we can't hire a historian of science. And libraries are marketed as places to hang out. So we have a $75 million library with a lot of chairs, and a lot of chairs and students just there. And reading this part, you feel yourself agreeing, pointing to the buildings on campuses. And if you need a tour, I could point out all the millions of dollars we spent downtown in Grand Rapids. But this feels the same, a phrase I keep coming back to. The word's feeling is, when we talk about feelings, is destructive because some people feel these things, like really feel these things, especially marginalized people. Reading his argument that this is class, I kept thinking about Malcolm X and what he said about American capitalism. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says American capitalism, you don't get American capitalism without racism. Or what Du Bois says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Or what Martin Luther King said 50 years ago, quote, we know full well that racism is still the hound hell which dogs the tracks of our civilization. Or what Tupac said 20 years ago, as I was navigating these culture wars, but also trying to survive an era of increased mass incarceration. Tupac said, quote, instead of a war on poverty, they have war on drugs so they can bother me. Or as Kaepernick said a couple years ago, quote, I'm not going to stand up to show pride in the flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color. To me, this is bigger than football, and it would be selfish on my part to look the other way. There are bodies in the street and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder. All this to say is we can't divorce the reality of race and racism when we're talking about class, capitalism, or economic anxieties. Because after all, on social media and amongst scholars, economic anxieties, in my world, is a code word we use to say that this is really about white racism. So why not name it? Major newspaper outlets have done pieces that focus on white working class folks. It's their job, the white working class, that we want to get back. It's their pain that we want to feel. And don't get me started on the opiate crisis, where all of a sudden we have a capacity to care about people on drugs. White addicts get care. Black addicts got jail. And I think this is where the conclusion needs to go. Recenter race in the conversation. Charlottesville was real and had nothing to do with economic anxiety or culture wars. We aren't fighting over these statues. We're fighting because those are the relics of racism that are reminders that this is all about race. Those are monuments to white power. They're fighting for white power to maintain privilege, and this should be said. Economic anxiety is still a code word, and we can leave race and the impacts our policies have on these communities. I want to leave with one last story, a familiar story if you've been following the news. Right here in Michigan. It's about a boy, 14 years old, a black boy, who woke up late for school. He missed the bus and decided to walk to school. He got lost, so he decided to knock on the door of a random stranger's house. Instead of being a good Samaritan, the family's economic anxieties kicked in this suburban neighborhood. The wife screamed at the boy to get away, accusing him of trying to rob the house. And then the husband came downstairs, brandishing a gun. As the boy fled, the man shot him, trying to kill him. Luckily, he lived. This all feels the same to me. Thank you.
First, I want to say, again, thanks very much to the hosts of this Common Ground Initiative for the privilege to participate in this panel and conference. It's really been a pleasure to view the draft of Professor Hartman's new conclusion, which, as you've heard from the talk, reflects a very new direction in what was once the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s. And just to give a little summary here, we heard about the impact of the Trump presidency, the MAGA movement generally, the changing nature of political polarization, the ways in which racial lines have been redrawn, the elevation of guns as probably the most divisive issue in the country right now, the liberal victory of gay marriage, the invigoration of feminism in the wake of Trump's electoral victory, the surge of anti-intellectualism in American society, and how it has converged mainly on humanities in higher education. And lastly, how and why we might have more success in democratizing our society and likewise humanities departments by examining the individualizing tendency of what humanities and many other scholars call identity politics. I think that the decision on the part of Hartman and the University of Chicago to do another print run of a war for the soul of America with this new conclusion is very wise, precisely because of the political and cultural moment that we're in right now. For my comments, I'm going to wander to different parts of the conclusion for the purposes of, one, asking for more clarification from you or maybe even for discussion. Second, by giving some of my own thoughts and raising possible questions that we might choose to discuss in the room or on the panel. So I really read this conclusion within your frame, long live the culture wars. So on the one hand, yes, I understand why you are sort of really tucking the culture wars away in the 1980s and 1990s, but also as a kind of the culture wars 2.0, even though this is something different and a huge departure. We are in a new and different phase of what you wrote about in that book, and it's hard to argue with, especially this idea of repolarization. But I think that you could go even a little bit further with this, especially since what you are writing about is cultural and intellectual history. And by this, I'm referring to the case of what populism has accomplished, what the Trump presidency, the MAGA movement has done, particularly in reframing reality. How institutions like news corporations, social media, how now data mining companies are literally creating separate worlds of facts where, for example, Pizzagate constitutes real news and Sandy Hook is a so-called hoax. The alternative reality that puts the alt in the alt-right. This is part of what you've already addressed in your writing about political correctness and the transformation of the right. But what I'm saying is, I think that what's changed has really gone further than that. There was conservative news back in the 1980s and 1990s, and Nicole Hemmer's book actually does pretty good work of talking about the ways that conservative news goes back even further. But the wholesale fantasy and conspiracy theory that captures political imagination today brings us to a very different phase, and so I'm curious what you think about that. Next, there's the issue of naming in your conclusion, words and concepts and the work that they do. Now, I'm not bringing this up as a way of doing any kind of censorship or trying to be the language police here. But what I'm saying is, I'm actually curious. This is where I'm asking you to be a little bit more precise when you go about your revisions, because I'm genuinely interested in knowing more about what you think when you use certain words. So here's one place where I think that you do it pretty well. On the one hand, there are expressions that receive, I think, appropriate treatment. Words like politically incorrect, where you historicize it. But then there's identity politics, which carries a similar history. So I think that many of us have a pretty good idea about the origins of the word, or maybe not. Identity politics as a word originated on the left, I believe in the 1970s. But as I'm sure we probably all agree, it's not mostly leftists who use that word to describe themselves. Nobody's thinking to themselves, yeah, I'm out there for identity politics. Yeah, or it'd be like saying, hey, I'm out there for political correctness. It's mostly a political category deployed by the right to describe the left and collapse many labels and forms of self-identity into one category. I'm personally interested in if that's the way in which you intend to use that meaning. I think the way Mark Lila talks about identity politics has a great deal of value in terms of how, as we moved into the later 20th century and more recent history, identity has preceded politics and substituted for politics, and the ways in which it's interfering with the exercise of institutional power. But I also think there's a way in which that's led to the ways in which he romanticizes the American right and the past, as if there is no identity politics in conservatism or in the past. And I can talk more about that with you at some other point. I don't want to belabor that. And then speaking of catch-all phrases, another concept that appears often in your conclusion is neoliberalism. You gave us here a definition, a short one, but didn't go into too much detail. Daniel Rogers wrote about this recently in a forum in the journal Dissent. Quote, "In the United States, neoliberalism is still largely a word of the academic and intellectual left. So-called neoliberals almost never use this word to describe their projects or themselves. It's a neologism that's has a function, but it really, many people would argue that it's kind of gotten all over the place. And so would you agree that this is the case? And I would urge you to go take a look at the forum. Oh, you have it? You got it, okay. The next is the way in which, I didn't know that, I didn't hear you talk about it today, but you use this word tribal. This is a word that I've heard a great deal of, and I actually use this word also to describe how Americans, even more so today, often tend to affiliate and participate in politics as if they were in a camp or on a team. And I found a pretty good definition by Hannah Arendt that describes the way I would use the term, characterized by a strong sense of loyalty to one's group. And the way you use it is, I think, in a similar vein. But you also quote David Brooks and other intellectuals. You quote public intellectuals in this conclusion quite a bit, and sometimes I don't know if you agree with them or you don't. David Brooks says the debate about guns right now has revealed, and he said this in the New York Times, that we don't really have policy debates anymore. We have one big tribal conflict, and policy fights are just proxy battles as each side tries to establish moral superiority. You know, I understand what that's about, but I also think that when David Brooks talks like this, he's being kind of snobby, and that the word tribal is referring to, he means uncivilized and primitive. And he was referring to the way that many of the people who are participating in the modern political realm they're not as cultivated as the world in which he started out in politics. I think he's wistful for a time that was more civil, meaning where we could have healthy debates like this and then go to the club and have a drink, right? I mean, yeah, it would be nice if everything could be like, you know, the Hauenstein Center. The last thing I want to talk about is the ending of the conclusion, where you address class struggle. And again, I didn't hear all of it in the talk, where you talk about a project of democratizing the academy and preserving the humanities. And again, you do this contrast between the problem of identity politics and how it's created this, it's created class struggles, or it's contributed to the problem of economic disparity. So you write that the attack on politically incorrect left-wing academics weakened the public's trust in universities, leaving them vulnerable to the legions of ALEC-type reformers who wish to make universities more focused on the bottom line. And I agree with another part. I actually agree with something you say here, that that multiculturalism that emerged out of this has been commodified by Madison Avenue and Silicon Valley into kind of a milquetoast version of identity politics. But I also think what hasn't been commodified? Class struggle certainly has also been commodified. You also say that the academic left's focus on identity politics was somewhat self-defeating in the long run. Identity politics are often in conflict with social democratic values in the sense that they divide people who should be united. The logic of identity politics submerges class and is focused instead on creating opportunities for individual ascent by previously excluded peoples. Hillary Clinton breaks the glass ceiling, which she didn't in the end, but millions of women, what? Did you? But millions of women remain in poverty with little chance of accessing a higher education. So the problems of economic disparity, this is me now, are real and pervasive. And feminism, of course, still has blind spots, but I am actually curious how you imagine this solidarity across class, race, and gender. I'm genuinely interested because the way I hear what you're saying is that people who are not male and white and elite actually shot themselves in the foot by not organizing with each other and collectively. It's hard for me, well, for a long time in history, they couldn't even do that without putting themselves in danger. And then the history of, there's the history of that collective organizing for class struggle, which was generally around the rights of the white male worker, the 8-hour day, family wage, Social Security. So there's baggage with the class struggle. That didn't include women and non-whites. So anyway, just to conclude, I'm only offering these thoughts about political polarization, identity politics, and neoliberalism, tribalized debate, is to say that I really do think that this is a worthy project to do this revision right now. And I think in general that the structure and the overall argument is very good, and I just am pushing you on these minor points. Thank you.
Well, let me also thank the organizers of the Progressive Conservative Summit, Gleaves Whitney and Scott St. Louis, for inviting me to participate in this program. It's an honor to be here to give a response to Professor Hartman and the new conclusion to his War for the Soul of America. And congratulations to Professor Hartman for the forthcoming second edition. It seems as though maybe one bright spot in the election of Donald Trump for Professor Hartman might be that he has a lot more writing material these days. But nevertheless, I am glad for the opportunity to hear more from Professor Hartman on this important topic, even if the circumstances surrounding the production of this chapter in particular were, to put it mildly, unexpected. Since the appearance of James Davison Hunter's landmark 1991 text, The Culture Wars, there has not been a historical assessment of the battles fought between left and right in the past 50 years as thorough and as more mature as Professor Hartman's. In casting the culture wars of the 80s and 90s in epistemological terms as a dispute about truth itself and truth's meaning, Hartman's book is sophisticated and it is lucid. Beginning as it does by considering the birth of the contemporary culture wars with the New Left of the 1960s, War for the Soul is nuanced, it is detailed, it is informed by careful and broad and original research. The topic is of immense importance, and Professor Hartman exhibits true courage in addressing this subject matter. It's very difficult to handle this topic without following the grooves of one's own presuppositions. And tackling recent or contemporary history, especially as loaded a theme as the culture wars is vastly challenging because the conclusions that you draw are put to the test before your very eyes. And Professor Hartman's courage extends even to the producing of this new conclusion, in which he seeks to address objections, objectors who would charge that the thesis he developed in 2015 has been utterly devastated by the events of 2016 and 2017. It might even be a daunting enough task for an American intellectual historian to seriously changing fields to something maybe a little further back in time, like paleontology or historical geology, something along those lines. But still, as a conservative and as an evangelical Christian, but perhaps more importantly, as an admirer and as a friend of Professor Hartman, my response to this chapter will be directed in two ways. First, I'd like to address the notion that there is something unique about the past 50 or so years in the long history of the American culture wars, so unique that Professor Hartman believes that they deserve their own appellation of era of culture wars proper. In short, I am not quite persuaded that there is very much qualitatively unique about the culture wars of the last 50 years, especially given some of the problems that Professor Hartman has mentioned in his talk and as Professor Moore has also spoken to. But also because, or as long as, I should say, Americans, generally speaking, have the shared intellectual resources from which to draw to bridge the divides in our society. And I think that they do. Now, secondly, by extension, I'd like to broaden the accepted paradigm of culture wars, a paradigm that's really only useful in contemporary history, to what I think is a more sustainable historical understanding of domestic, social, and political conflict as we watch it progress over time. And I have to apologize because I'm going to draw from a person who's unfamiliar to all of you, Alexis de Tocqueville, to attempt to do this. And before you completely give up on me and roll your eyes in exasperation, let me say that I think that his treatment of the irrepressible conflict between the majority and the minority in America is applicable to most cultural divides as they have appeared in American history. And also because Tocqueville offers a more helpful paradigm, I think, in terms of plotting a way forward across the crevasse-rent landscape of today's cultural and political discourse. So in my response, I aim not to provide Professor Hartman with the chapter of his second edition of the excellent book that he's written, that I wish he had written, but rather to at least try to address the question that he asks at the beginning of his chapter, when he says the more pressing question is to ask, what now? As Professor Hartman describes in the book, the culture wars are incredibly complex, with overlapping conflicts that are often confused and conflated one with another. The participants in the culture wars come from an enormous variety of political and religious persuasions, socioeconomic class, race and ethnicity, sexual orientations, and gender identities. And over the past few decades, we can describe the culture wars as including a number of distinct binaries simultaneously. For example, Romanticism versus the Enlightenment, intellectualism versus volitionalism, modernism versus postmodernism, deconstructionism versus absolutism, elitism versus populism. And I'm thinking, for example, of Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart. Therapeutic versus classical liberalism, perhaps exemplified by, for example, Paul Gottfried's book, Multiculturalism and the Politics of Guilt. Individualism versus communitarianism, as in Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone. Nationalism, and when I say nationalism, I'm not really thinking specifically of ethno-nationalism, but the idea of the nation state versus globalism or versus identity politics. Consolidation versus disaggregation, as Daniel Rogers talks about in Age of Fracture. Progressivism versus orthodoxy, as Professor Hartman addresses in his book. And then finally, for another example, radical secularism versus religious nationalism, as Philip Gorski argues in his book, American Covenant. Many of these binary conflicts, and forgive the simplification that I've cast them in for my purposes here, many of these have arisen in contemporary times, but many are also leftover conflicts from earlier periods in American history, some going as far back as the colonial period itself. And some of these conflicts have arisen only recently, but are still intensified and brought into higher relief by the older debates. Professor Hartman could give some room in his book for explanation of some of the older leftover conflicts and those that have developed more recently, in order to further argue for the complexity and uniqueness of the culture wars in recent and contemporary history. To put this point more succinctly, why does Trump's election specifically matter substantially to the culture wars when the conflicts that he represents and embodies have been around for a very long time and will persist after he is gone? What difference at this point does it make, to quote a recent presidential contender? The class struggle argument in particular has a great deal of merit, I believe, and I want to echo Professor Nickerson's critique. What is it exactly, what is it substantially about the class struggle argument in terms of justifying the uniqueness of the moment that we are experiencing now? Another aspect of the complexity of the culture wars, which continues to address my concern about the persuasiveness of the way Professor Hartman characterizes the uniqueness of the divisions of the past 50 or so years, and particularly now, is this shortage of the explanations regarding the role of religion. For example, this shortage results in what seems to be a misunderstanding of how evangelical Christians in particular interpret the most salient debates in today's culture wars, like, take for example, the recent Obergefell decision. For example, Hartman believes that Southern Baptists have actually resigned themselves to, as he says, admit defeat in the gay marriage debate. Now, while the court's decision, of course, is incontrovertible, the Southern Baptist Convention has hardly hoisted the white flag. And nevertheless, in discussing the decline of evangelicalism in America, this is a very, very long and slow process that goes back many decades. It didn't just start in the last 10, 15 years. This is not a new trend. It's been going on at least since the Civil War. And while it's true that 81% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, there is little here in the direction of explaining reasons why so many evangelicals voted the way they did, at least beyond characterizations of homophobia, nostalgia, racism, sexism, hypocrisy, and other base motivations. Now, clearly, Professor Hartman is not arguing that the culture wars are unprecedented or new in American history. That would be unfair to characterize the argument in such a way. But it is difficult to see how the culture wars deserve to be raised upon the pedestal of defining the past 50 years, that we are living in an era of the culture wars, as Hartman puts it. Surely there are periods in American history that can be defined in terms of profound domestic strife, and I'm thinking particularly of the period from 1861 to 1877. But as long as Americans have cultural, historical, aesthetic, religious, philosophical, political resources from which to draw, there is hope for bridging those divides. The Civil War, by contrast, was fought partly because those resources were no longer commonly accessible to Americans. Perhaps another way to think about the culture wars is to utilize this paradigm I've referred to earlier that Tocqueville provides us with in Democracy in America. In chapter 15 of volume 1, Tocqueville writes that as long as sovereignty rests with the people in America, not a monarch, in other words, as long as America remains a democracy, the majority of the people rule, both politically and culturally. The power of the majority is absolute, and anytime power is absolute, grave danger to freedom exists. Human nature tends towards abuse of power, and the majority tends to tyrannize the minority, and we see this all through American history. An excellent example of how the tyranny of majority works, Tocqueville wrote, is in the way free speech operates in America. And we've talked about this in our times in the previous panels earlier. In American democracy, in which the majority rules, free speech is never absolute. For example, while the people consider a particular issue in American culture, take same-sex marriage, for example. Speech is completely free. Both sides, those opposed, those in favor, make their arguments. The majority begins to coalesce around a particular position, and during that time, both sides are free to speak up and make their arguments. But once the majority's view is settled, speech on that issue is no longer free. A line is drawn, so to speak, around the issue defining what is acceptable to the majority and what is off limits. Those who are in the minority quickly learn to keep their opinions and their arguments to themselves or face dire consequences. Here's a small passage of how Tocqueville describes this dynamic. He said, "In America, the majority raises formidable barriers around the liberty of opinion. Within these barriers, an author may write what he pleases, but woe to him if he goes beyond them. He is exposed to continuous obloquy and persecution. The master, that is the majority, says, 'You are free to think differently from me and to retain your life, your property, and all you possess. But you are henceforth a stranger among your people. You may retain your civil rights, but they will be useless to you. For you will never be chosen by your fellow citizens if you solicit their votes. And they will affect to scorn you if you ask for their esteem. You will remain among men, but you will be deprived of the rights of mankind. Your fellow creatures will shun you like an impure being, and even those who believe in your innocence will abandon you, lest they should be shunned in their turn. And go in peace. I have given you your life, but it is an existence worse than death.'" Tocqueville wrote that we know Americans have lost their freedom when the minority no longer believes that there is any common intellectual or cultural resource to access in order to bridge the partisan divides. And all that's left to them is violence. Indeed, we can look to numerous episodes in American history when minorities representing various groups have done just that. Now, I'm going to speed this up a little bit. I've got some other comments we can talk a little bit later on about those. But let me just close. In the context of the larger work, for example, Hartman asks at the end of this chapter, can we have both multiculturalism and social democracy? In the context of the larger work, and in the context of plotting a way forward, it seems that Professor Hartman might find it appropriate to consider that folks on the right might see that there are more options for America's future direction than merely those two. For example, what about a pursuit of federalism, more true to the form of the framers' vision than the one that seems to prevail now? What about recognizing a tradition, as Philip Gorski writes, that is self-conscious of its past and deepened and widened by change, making it more inclusive? Or what about the recovery of what Arthur Schlesinger called a vital center, a collection of American ideals that left and right broadly share and still have room to hash out in debate and dialogue? Ideals such as freedom of self-expression, freedom of conscience, freedom to voluntarily associate, and even those such as hard work and perseverance can be articulated and applied without prejudice, exclusion, or jingoism. So Professor Hartman, you're to be commended for providing us with a powerful impetus for moving the conversations forward concerning the real differences in our country. And I admire you for your insights, for your eloquence, for your erudition, and I hope that you will accept me as a worthy interlocutor. Thank you very much.
I'm not going to take too much time responding because I know that some of you might have questions. I want to get to that. Just a few things briefly. That was both exhilarating and frightening. There must be a German word for that, Professor Domitrovic, yeah? Angst, okay. So one of the common critiques of any book is that you don't do something. You know, you want, and there's like 2 points that could be made when somebody says, you didn't write about Hilton Kramer and New Criterion. One is that the person making that critique really likes Hilton Kramer and the New Criterion and wants a book, can't imagine a book without Hilton Kramer and the New Criterion. But I think you make a larger point, and that is that Hilton Kramer represents a conservatism that is crucial because he critiques modernity or modernism from within in a way, and so your assumption is that I needed Hilton Kramer to do that work, otherwise conservatism is flat and unsophisticated and a straw man. And most left-leaning historians like myself, that's how we treat conservatism. Which I guess would be fair, but I deal with all kinds of conservatives who make exactly that point in different sort of realms. I dedicate an entire chapter to the neoconservatives who essentially critiqued modernism going too far in the realms of politics and education. I deal with I deal in very serious fashion with Alan Bloom and other conservative thinkers who are doing what Kramer did. So I think, yes, I could have added something especially to my chapter on sort of art and censorship with an edition of Kramer, but what you think Kramer would do in the book, I think that's already been done. The criticisms made by Professors Moore and Nickerson are, like, I take very seriously, especially the ones about like race hasn't gone anywhere, racism hasn't gone anywhere, identity politics, what do you mean by that? Why be so dismissive? And I guess the first issue is that because this is a new conclusion to a book already in existence, I historicize identity politics quite extensively in a few of my chapters. So I guess I'm working from the assumption that I have some credentials to say something about identity politics in very sort of loose and vague terms in the conclusion. But I agree with you, Michelle, that I could do more, especially because I make some pretty provocative claims. To Professor Moore's criticism, I see your point and I agree with you. I guess it's a problem of language. When I say class, I don't mean white. But I know that in our sort of popular discourse, that's often what we take to mean as class, is the white working class. So I just need to be more nuanced and explain more, I think, in my conclusion. But so thanks for those criticisms. And then Professor Wilsey, all I can say is that I definitely take your criticism to heart. As a historian, especially when you're writing about sort of big, grand themes, one of the problems is, are you somebody who emphasizes change or do you emphasize continuity? And obviously in this book, I'm emphasizing change to the nth degree. And sometimes that's problematic because one of the roles of historians that's really important, especially in a culture that is so seeped in current events, is we have pundits who think that everything is new, oh my God, because that sells. The role of the historian is to say, we've been here before, calm down, this is the way this has happened in the past. And so I think that's an important role that we play in public discourse if we are allowed to speak in public discourse and if we are heard from. But I guess because I've thought obviously a lot about this topic, and I think that the transformations of the 1960s in terms of American culture were extremely profound, and a lot of people will disagree with me, and that's just, we're gonna have to agree to disagree on that and sort of continue to hash it out. And the way we interpret the past will continue to change as the present kicks our butt. So thank you very much, all of you. And if you have written comments, I'd love for you to email it to me. That'd be very helpful. So thank you very much. Yes.
Well, I very much enjoyed the panel, but I wanted to ask, in addition to the left-right culture wars, which I think the panel has discussed and Professor Hartman has discussed as well, what about the seemingly intensifying culture war within the left and within the right? So among Republicans and conservatives, there is a very stark cultural divide, ethically, sociologically, in terms of philosophy and politics as well, between the Trump supporters and never Trump. Similarly, I think on the left you see some very stark cultural divides emerging. Some of them are traced by the distinction between Clinton voters and Sanders voters, but really those political divisions, I think, are perhaps just the outward and visible manifestation of deeper spiritual and philosophical divisions that are starting to emerge. It seems to me as if, in some ways, the culture wars are changing from left, right to up and down, or inside out. But perhaps others here have a different perspective. But this does seem to be a sort of emerging new field, or at least a widening field, in the culture wars, as opposed to the old traditional progressive, conservative, left-right.
I think that's an excellent point. I especially notice it on the left. If you spend any time on left Twitter, there are major divides that sound a lot like the culture wars in terms of different approaches to thinking about not just politics, but how we identify ourselves politically, how we organize our thoughts about political life. So I think that's an excellent point, but if anyone else has anything to add to that.
It's so interesting. I never thought about it in terms of a culture war so much as a political war and the problem of social movements. But I don't know, how is it cultural? Sorry.
Getting your workout today.
Sorry, yeah.
On the right, it's cultural in the sense that there really are, I think, sociological divisions between the sort of think tank class, which tends to be where you find the never Trump people, and the grassroots Republicans. You can also see this in terms of media as well.
Yeah.
The people who read the New Criterion, although this is changing a little bit, but the people who read the New Criterion tend to be rather different from the people who listen to Alex Jones, for example. And that many of the same sorts of divisions you see between left and right. Some of the things that have been said, for example, here and in previous sessions about views of higher education, et cetera, you can find the same sorts of divisions within the right itself. In these different levels. And again, I don't want to oversimplify. I mentioned the New Criterion a minute ago, but actually Roger Kimball, the editor of the New Criterion, is a Trump supporter, and it's actually very interesting to see that many of the most intellectually lively publications, First Things, which has Rusty Reno as its editor, also the Claremont Review of Books, these publications all had editors who tended to be pro-Trump. And yet the editors of some of the former sort of mainstream defining conservative publications, such as the Weekly Standard or National Review, they were very strongly never Trump. So there's a division here which is, again, I think it's sociological, professional. In some cases there may be religious dimensions to it. And there's certainly just a visceral, I think, difference in terms of outlook between these two factions of the right. And I think there is a parallel here on the left as well. As Andrew had mentioned, I watch plenty of left Twitter, and it's very interesting and very, just fascinating from for a right-wing perspective to see these very, very bitter, fights between people who defend Clinton and people who oppose her. You're right that it's, there's a very strong political dimension here, but it's not just that. I mean, in some ways it goes right back to what our previous speaker had said, which is some people believe in this kind of mainstream center that they want to see recovered, this kind of Enlightenment ideal that can encompass, sort of both the left and the right, perhaps, even if it has a center of gravity on one side or the other. And then, on the other hand, there are people who really think that that spectrum is a sham, and that, in fact, there is a need to kind of shake things up, break things up, and restructure the entire alignment, so that now maybe that means the left, wins, or that the right wins, that you get a monopole in one side or the other. But it's a really fierce debate, not only that the left and right are having with one another, but that they're also having kind of with the center part of the spectrum where both of them are concerned. So I don't know. I mean, is there another sense in which it should be cultural as opposed to political?
No, I was only asking, and I think you're absolutely, I would agree that there's the same thing as happening on the left, but when I think of like a culture war, I think like people fighting about culture. And so it makes me think even that we are in a different kind of place, but in terms of the differences in like when you're talking about the different institutions and the actual divisions, then I do think that it's a very similar split on the left as on the right.
Because I'm an intellectual historian deeply interested in continental philosophy, I see it as a division on the left between Marx and Foucault. I think those of us present for Professor Worthen's talk get a good sense of the distillation of Foucault amongst many on the left and how that informs our sense of power and witness to power and that type of thing. But there are many on the left who have a much more sort of 19th century, still part of the Enlightenment project, sort of view of power and how to sort of work within, to be both in and of society and work within society in sort of Enlightenment. It's still very much a project of the Enlightenment. And the people in that camp don't think we can write off whole segments of the American people, the American working class, just because they're unvirtuous. And that's really where the sort of lines of debate seem to be drawn on the left.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just say a few words.
Okay. Well, if the last 24 hours have been a movie, we now come to the credits. I want to thank a few people who made today and yesterday, last night, a remarkable experience. First of all, I want to thank the speakers. All the speakers that we had with you today, I learned a lot from, and from the comments that I heard today, I think a lot of us learned a lot from the speakers. So thank you so much for bringing your A game to this summit. I also want to thank the partners, Annette Kirk, Noreen Myers. I want to thank the people who are the members of the Hauenstein Center, the donors to the Hauenstein Center, who help make programs like this possible. There is no free lunch, so they're essential to this operation as well. And I've not said anything yet about this group, but now the time has come for me to acknowledge them. The staff at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies has done splendidly in its work to help put this on. I especially want to point out Scott St. Louis, who was my partner in this whole process. He's the program manager of our Common Ground initiative, and he has certainly helped make this work. Please give Scott and my staff a hand. I don't know what you call the part of the movie, where you have the movie and then you have the credits and then all of a sudden you have a scene at the very end of the movie. And I know that I am the only thing standing between you and the dessert reception out there, so I want to make this brief. But I feel really strongly about this. We bring people together who have commitments on the left and right. They have commitments to innovation and conservation. Any modern society is going to have those two parties. But there's a third place to be. The third place is in between those two. It's a place of dynamic tension, and it's a place where you can suspend your own judgment long enough to listen to others. And I like to think that those of us in education know how to be in that area, that zone of tension. A theologian, Paul Tillich, claimed that he liked to live in that space in his intellectual life, that he would neither go entirely over to the conservatives or entirely over to the progressives, but he would be in that zone of tension so that he could always facilitate the dialogue. I like to think that the spirit of these Common Ground Initiative programs is in that third space between the two, kind of like covalent bonding if you're a chemist, or the estuary between the land and the sea, the richest ecosystem, by the way, the estuary, that we're providing an estuary for that conversation to take place. Thank you for being part of that conversation. Stay tuned for another great program next year. Thanks.